hopefully that's working. What have I done wrong? Okay. Okay, cool. Right. Okay, good. Cool. All right. Okay. So this was the program which we had together. We want to try and talk to people a little bit about the context of biodiscovery from an international point of view. A lot of things that Katie's been a part of, and then Ketie's coming to talk about Kingitanga. If you don't know what Kingitanga is, she will talk to that. But it's the group that has been working alongside the Y262, and so the claimants associated with that, with moving along that kaupapa. We've got give an idea about some of the projects that we're doing at the Tikanga Research Institute that are in this sort of biodiscovery space. We're probably going to shift that to a little bit later and then bring forward some of the conversations about different resources that are there. And in the middle of all that, we're also going to ask you some questions, really kind of talk a little bit about the things that you think are relevant in the context of biodiscovery and some of the challenges we think about when we think about ponga species and kaitiaki and how that should be managed as we move forward. So I probably should do proper introductions to people. KatieLee Riddle is going to come and talk about the international context. She's been working with us for a number of years. She has recently been a negotiator on behalf of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity as a part of the Conference of Parties negotiations around digital sequence information. Has been really involved in a whole lot, kind of increasingly involved in more and more international initiatives. So, Katie, come on. Yeah.
It's great to see so many of you in the audience. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you. I'm just going to take you through some of the international context. Some of it I've been involved with, some of it I have not. Some of it will just be a bit of a background for you. So first of all, I wanted to talk to you about the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. And this is an international convention that New Zealand is a party to. It is an international instrument, so a whole bunch of countries have signed up to this, mostly except the USA. And there are a few parts within this international law that speak about traditional knowledge and the protection of traditional knowledge. So the law as a whole is made to help the conservation of biodiversity, the sustainable use of biodiversity, and to reflect adequate benefit sharing for the use of biodiversity. And within that, we have special carve-outs for Indigenous peoples. So the main article for that is Article 8J, and this is a large passage of law that really deals with a lot of the use of traditional knowledge and Indigenous knowledge systems and the protection of our knowledge systems. So it really maintains that our knowledge must be preserved, maintained, and respected. And part of that is recognising Indigenous knowledge as valid and equal to and of use of Western science, and really raising the profile of Indigenous knowledge within biodiversity conservation. It recognises our governance over our lands, waters, and territories, and it affirms that we need to have Indigenous control over Indigenous resources. And then it also talks a little bit about how our knowledge and data is used. So the kind of protocols that should be in place when researchers want to work with our communities. So what that means is there are a couple different things. We should have prior informed consent, and we should have mutually agreed terms. So we need adequate research contracts and benefit sharing contracts and all of those kind of contracts in place, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Next is the Nagoya Protocol. It's a law underneath the CBD. And this is specifically about access and use of genetic resources. So when people are coming into our lands and accessing our natural resources, what things should be in place. And this is specifically where we get into prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms. And it says that before researchers use our traditional knowledge, we need to have those in place first. And so it's really also about that, and then it's also about fair and equitable benefit sharing. So we as Indigenous peoples should see benefits of that research coming back to our people. So how do we go about making sure that that actually happens? So a lot of that is also about benefit sharing, so about monetary benefit sharing, so finances coming back to Indigenous peoples in certain ways, whether it's funding our restoration projects and things like that, or non-monetary benefit sharing, so building our capacity and building our ability to help make our own informed decisions and our own rangatiratanga. So the part that I was specifically involved in was about digital sequence information. Now, if you're familiar with biology and DNA code, you'll know that there's those ATCG base pairs, and you have that little code that makes up the DNA code. And that really big, long code then gets put in a database, and you can use it to identify what parts of a gene make a specific resource useful. For example, what makes kawakawa anti-inflammatory? You can go look at the DNA, compare that DNA to a whole bunch of other DNA and see, okay, what about kawakawa is unique? What makes it unique in its genetic code? And one of the problems with DSI previously is that it's not considered a genetic resource. It's not a physical resource in and of itself. It's just a code. And so what that means is that for the need for prior informed consent and the mutually agreed terms and the benefit sharing that are all done under Nagoya don't apply to DSI. And this created a bit of a Wild West situation where people could use this information without any kind of restrictions or parameters in place. So the UN said, okay, we need to kind of get ahead of this and start figuring out what kind of protocols and policies should be in place to help navigate that in a fair and equitable way. So that was all negotiated over the last few years. The gavel went down on it in last October. And one of the key things that came out of this was a really big international fund called the KatieLee Fund. Now, this fund is a benefit sharing fund so that those businesses who access and use DSI and make a commercial profit off of the use of DSI have to give a portion of their profits into the fund, which then gets sent to biodiversity restoration projects and grassroots projects at least, and at least 50% of that money has to go to Indigenous peoples and local communities. So that was a really big win for us. So we're hoping that really big pharmaceutical companies like Bayer can be putting potentially millions of dollars into this fund, which we can then have access to directly or as directly as possible to our communities to fund our biodiversity restoration projects. The next new bit of international law that's recently come out is at the World Intellectual Property Organization. And this is the Genetic Resources and Associated Traditional Knowledge Treaty. Now, this is a new patenting law which states that when you're using genetic resources as part of your product development and patenting, that you have to disclose where those genetic resources are from. And part of that is if you're using traditional knowledge, you have to identify which community that knowledge comes from. Previously, you didn't have to do that. You could just say, hey, if you want to, you could say, hey, we might have used some Indigenous knowledge here, but we don't have to tell you who or where. Now you do. So this is a really important one. New Zealand is a signatory to it, so that is being rolled out in New Zealand. So if you're using Indigenous knowledge, you have to tell people where it comes from, and ideally benefits need to be going back to the community. So I think that's all we had for Indigenous law for now, and we'll move on over to national context. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thanks, Ed. Don't worry, she'll be back. She'll be back. So just so now I just want to invite Keti Marsh-Solomon to the podium. She's had responsibilities around Te Ake Taonga since it's been established, so
yeah,
she'll inform us better than me.
That's a sweet, right?
Yeah, just put it on there. And give it a click.
Bye-bye. Testing. Tēnā koutou, he ngā pui e tūnei, ko Keti Marsh, missing the H up there, Solomon tōku ingoa. As Maui has said, my responsibility has been in the kaupapa management office of Te Taumata Whakapūmau I Te Mauri o Y262, and the emergence of Tikanga through an ethical process for resolution of Y262 issues. It is but one solution of a mosaic of solutions, including the international solutions that Caddie, Maui, and others work on. And so I've been given the awesome task of in 10 minutes getting you across 4 years of work and 30 plus years of fights, of pakanga, and of silent pathway building. So, yep, we'll move on. How do I do this? Talk to Y262 Tikanga and how it's come to be. At the end, I'll provide you with some information, a QR code, where you can dig a little bit deeper into the mahi's done and you can get involved yourself. So why does biodiscovery and bioprospecting matter to Tikanga? Well, it's at the intersection of tikanga, science and economics. Through the ethical process, or Māori to Māori conversations, we heard from our whānau, hapu and iwi, that the opportunities for wellbeing, climate resilience, and prosperity, economic prosperity, exist within this work. But, you know, what Y262 really speaks to are the risks around biopiracy and other forms of misappropriation. And so Tikanga, one of our really cool legal minds, Keti Toki, often talks about Tikanga having a distinct role, that it's an elegant solution, and that we've mapped the solutions and we've found one place that Te Taumata Whakapuma i Te Māori can support, and that really is to continue to uphold tino rangatiratanga over taonga and mātauranga Māori. And it also matters because a lot of this work has to be done at the interface with our partner, our treaty partner. And that's hard and that's fraught. And working outside of an institution like Waikato University or other institutions that are well-resourced to do research, it's really difficult to bind the partner to actively protect the solutions that our whānau are asking for. So progress thus far, Tikanga framework has been developed and applied through case studies. So our Y262 biodiscovery technical team made up of Manu, Caddie, Lee Winiata, Turunga Winiata, and Leo Hudson tested the framework through kānuka, kina, berries, and wairuakohu. And so we're using those insights from those case studies to continue to inform Tikanga. We have a bunch of tools, including software tools, that can support whānau, Pākehā Māori, hapu and iwi to continue to protect their taonga and associated mātauranga. And then we have just some really basic, not as technical tools as Te Kotahitanga Institute's stuff, but some basic things for the everyday whānau who want to engage in this work. We obviously have international links, CBD, WIPO, UNDRIP. We can geek out for days about that. We see areas of opportunity in the cracks that have formed in this relationship, in this so-called treaty relationship. So we know that Y262 forces in all of government response to the issues that were raised in the claim, in the original claim. And fragmented crowd policy is a major issue, and one puna sitting in, one puni sitting in TPK is not going to address it. But we've seen the opportunity to kind of pivot, turn away from the crown, and advance tikanga-led approaches outside of that political sphere. Build evidence through iwi hapu, whānau, Pākehā Māori, so testing, tikanga, in practice, in project, in research, and being ready for proven models when the Crown is ready to listen, if they ever are. So beyond biodiscovery, and just the premise, I'm fourth in line to talk about biodiscovery and bioprospecting, so I wasn't directly involved with that technical work. My job is to skim, read the top and see the value in the mahi, and then present that back to the decision-making framework and to disseminate the information. So tikanga is kind of no single discipline, and it's collaboration really of experts across work streams, which we feel is really vital. And Maui, Hudson and I were having a conversation before this presentation around the necessity of spaces like this, where we can speak for longer than 10 minutes about the core ingredients of this work that can make mana mo te hake me te tino rangatiratanga a living and real thing. And whoa, that looks like a lot, but that's a lot simpler than it used to be. Those are kind of like the spheres we engaged with in collaborative design for Tikanga, so kind of groups and minds that we put into one place, that we tested commons, what should be commodified, what shouldn't be commodified across sector, what are our tōhunga thinking about that, how can they inform the tikanga that informs this tikanga framework. That's kind of how we've rolled, and I'd like to simplify it further. Our team would like to simplify it further to something that looks kind of like this, where we have a better way for technicians, tōhunga, and kaitiaki to work together in unison and bring those solutions to the table. So yeah, I think I'm almost at my 10 minutes. Carry on. If you want to join the kaupapa, this sounds like a marketing ploy, but yeah, like I think, no one is an expert in Y262, and if you think you are, I'd like to put you in some of the spaces we've been in and challenge you around that. And there's space for everyone to contribute to the solutions. Tikanga offers you a place to come and contribute. We're completely open to having both technical conversations and conversations in the realm of our tohunga as well. And then people like me bring those two realms together to try and figure out, what comes out the other end. Pauara are really important when it comes to tikanga. And I wish I had a handout today, but I do have a QR code at the end. But when we're talking about tikanga, biodiscovery, economics, you have to have principles in practice. And so what we've done is we've tested principles around the protection of our taonga across Aotearoa, 25,000 plus whānau hapu and iwi have engaged with those principles, and they are points of consensus. Of course, people want others, like we could have 100 principles, but Te Aki Tonga now holds some really core principles that I hope you'll go away and look up after this session. No reira? Yeah, so if you want to be part of building a Māori-led values-based system for Aotearoa, Te Aki Tonga is one of the places you can come and do that. Invitation is open. So tēnā koutou katoa. Oh, QR code. QR code. Register.
Thanks. So I think you're hopefully you're getting a little bit of an idea about sort of in some ways the complexity of the situation, but also like the scope of this sort of work. And if I was thinking about it in some ways, like from a historical point of view, we knew that when the settlers first came over, when Joseph Banks came over with Cook, they were collecting samples of plants. They're really interested in the different sorts of things that were happening around. And those things are sitting in herbaria and museums all around the world. And, over time, as sort of technology has gotten better and better and people can now sort of explore them in different ways, they're going in that direction to find their samples. And so it's a challenging space. I think probably in the 90s when Y262 first got put into place, or the claim first went out, it was a little bit of a shot over the bow of scientific practice and kind of pushed people away from it for a while. And there was a sort of a reluctance for people to get involved in this kind of work. But in the last decade or so, they've been circling again, often working directly with communities, but also just because of the increasing interest and value that's being emerged, that's being generated from native plants and species. And so I think, these sorts of conversations that Te Ake Tong have been having have been really important in terms of kind of like generating some ideas and thinking about how we should be approaching that in a different sort of way. I'm just going to roll through into the project stuff, because I think there's like a little bit of a context here about describing some of the projects, the new projects that are emerging, so you can see in a practical way too some of the things that different groups are doing and thinking about. So this is a project that's been funded by MB. It's led by the University of Waikato at the field station in Tauranga, but looking at seaweeds. And so seaweeds which they went out and sourced from Te Moana o Toi, and then have sort of grown up and now are looking at how they can be used for crop protection. So essentially using them on kiwi fruit orchards to help get rid of, some of the, what was the thing that they had, that kiwi fruit had? The PSA. Yeah. So deal with PSA and other sorts of, threats to the crop. And usually so the pictures you can see here this is the field station in Tauranga, where they're kind of growing out, these different seaweed species. And so what tends to happen is there's a big part of these programs that's built around the science components, understanding what have they got there, the structure, activity, and mode of actions, and then thinking about how that gets commercialized, what sorts of production processes are required for that. And we've been fortunate to work with them around the sort of Vision Mā Tauranga part of the project, around this part looking at he whakapapa tō te tonga, so Māori interest in that process of agrochemical development. And these are the sorts of activities that we'll be involved in, or we are involved in. They've established a Kāhui Māori to guide the project. They're going to have a meeting next week. We've been developing a data management audit tool, so you can kind of think about where is the data that gets collected, where does it end up, where is it stored, who is it being shared with, some of those sorts of things, because you can't manage things if you can't track them. And so being in a position where you can see where things are going allows you to think consciously about those parts. We're going to extend the benefit sharing game. That's something which we'll show you later. Got to put in ethics. There's one which will have really thinking about what sorts of tikanga can inform those processes, and then also thinking about how local context can support the recognition of provenance as data is moving through different places as well. And we'll give some examples of that a little bit later. But you can see there some of the team members, and ask one of them, to come and share a little bit about the sort of work that he'll be doing alongside some of our iwi partners. So, kia ora, Danny.
Kia ora tātou. Me tukai kia koutou, te mana whenua ki reo tātou mihianga kia koutou, ko karanga kia mātou. Iwi katoa te motu, ko tai mai tēnei tagata no te whakatōhia ki mai i au koutou re e mihianga. I'm one slide guy, so I'm only just going to give you a brief kōrero about this particular part of the research that I'll be involved with, and it's great to hear the context of our previous speakers as well as to the mahi that they've been doing. But firstly, my working role as iwi development manager for Te Tāwhare o Te Whakatōhia. I've had the privilege of working alongside Maui and Natalie and the team in developing and applying traditional knowledge labels and biocultural labels to help us to look after our tonga within our rohe, within our iwi. We've also developed essential technologies like a Whakatōhia digital library to help store digital archives and to make it accessible for our people as well. So coming into this particular space is really interesting in the sense that I liked hearing about the kōrero from Keti that DNA is really important. In our opinion, Māori have been practicing this for many generations through the use of whakapapa. and storytelling. And so I think this is really important too, that once, for us to identify the relationship between the seaweed, the taonga within the taonga, that Tongaro has for us, and how it could potentially support economic development by applying the benefits of the seaweed for the use of kiwi fruit, etc., is really important for us. So I think to look at the DNA, the biochemistry of the seaweed, we must also align our whakapapa, our kōrero tiku iho into that particular space. So my role as a part of this particular project is to work with our iwi within our whakatohea iwi and to work alongside other iwi to capture some of the kōrero that they may have in relation to the whakapapa of seaweed and how it could potentially relate to food that is grown on land such as kiwi fruit. And, we only have to go back to look at and listen to the stories of Ranginui and Papatūnuku and the creation stories from there on. So that's going to be my part of the project, to work alongside that. The other essential part too is with the traditional knowledge labels that have been developed through the years of work with Maui and his team through local context, is to look at how we can apply these labels to help iwi to protect their kōrero, their taonga, by the application of those particular labels. So, koira nohi ho mō tēnei wā, no tēnei tangata, no reira kia ora tātou.
You spoke about the first couple of points. It was leaving you hanging on the other ones, but I think one of the other ones is important too, is about how do we engage our communities in conversations about that commercialization pathway. And one of the reasons for thinking about the application of labels to sort of scientific research data is that it often takes a long time before it becomes a part of a commercialization venture. And it's got to go through a lot of different steps and go through a lot of different hands before it gets to that point. And so the person you've spoken with about the research isn't the one that then is going to do that other activity, and they don't necessarily know who you are. And if they're just getting information out of scientific databases, often there's nothing that points back to that relationship. And so trying to maintain that whakapapa of those relationships and that kōrero through the data is one of the things we're trying to do. But so that the communities can be a part of those commercialization conversations. So Danny will do some kōrero sort of around that, benefit sharing pathways and commercialization. That'll also be supported by the activities which Michaela Anderson is going to do. She's not here talking because she's at the Kingitanga Day at Tauranga, on the Tauranga campus, contributing to that. But she's going to work on her PhD around how kaitiaki-centered business approaches can ensure the cultural integrity of taonga species during commercialization. And part of this comes out of her own whānau experience of working with the brand Ora, where they make use of mamaku and other native species as part of products. So she's got this sort of direct experience there, which she's wanting to explore a little bit more and think about things like provenance and authenticity, certification and traceability, and how that will help with sort of more ethical business practices. So there's a few parts to that, but that's sort of one project. And the interesting thing, I noted that Keti, or the Kingitanga, had highlighted the sort of the gap around the marine space. So, we've got one project here on seaweed, and the other project we're involved with is this one around fish cell production systems. Has anyone got an idea what that is? Anyone heard of cellular agriculture? So, when they kind of like were going to, grow your hamburger bun in the lab, grow up like that, that's what it is. But instead of meat and hamburgers, this is fish cells. And one of the things with this is that one of the fish they're interested in using is a taonga species, a Māori, hehika. So getting involved in this conversation is another thing. This is, in some ways, the next thing along the track. So if you think about the conversations that Caddie was talking about how people look at the DNA or look at the genetic codes of plants. then they're thinking about how they can identify particular traits and how those might be used for particular activities. So it might be, to develop a product, but also to make a change to those species if you think about how people develop crops. And then how you grow things in the lab. Cellular agriculture becomes just the next part on that slippery slope of technology. So this project is led by Plant and Food Research out of their Nelson office, which has got a kind of an aquaculture component. That's Georgina Dell. She's the PI on it. And you see here the same that same thing as like the last project, big components around the science and what's required there. Bits around thinking about what's the right type of culture to grow these cells in. How do you feed the cells in the most sort of appropriate way? And then what's required to turn them into particular types of cells which are useful. And so one of the things they're thinking about doing is how you produce collagen. Who knows what collagen is? Yeah. So the use of collagen is one, so then can generate that in the lab. And then the other one is muscle cell, or essentially, I guess the fillet into the future. But you see they're looking at that in the context of salmon, but also ling, and ling's a native species. But there is also this other component thinking about what are the social and cultural contexts for the use of cellular agriculture here in New Zealand. And we're the group that's looking at a part of that picture. So this is also thinking about a little bit like the agrochemical development, working through a cellular agriculture pathway. How do Māori find a space in that and benefit from it as well? And so we'll have doing different activities, literature review. Caddie is doing a PhD. We've got to start thinking about talking to people about what are their views on this, how do they think about it, and understanding that, then think about what sorts of solutions there might be as well. So I'm going to hand this back to Caddie so she can tell you a little bit about what she's got planned for her PhD study.
So I started this last week, and it kind of sounds like a bit of science fiction, doesn't it? Lab grown meat, what the hell? But one of the exciting things about science is the way that we innovate so quickly, but one of the scary parts is that science and innovation move so quickly that law and policy can't always keep up. And so we create this system where it's a bit of a Wild West, again, a bit like DSI, where the science is evolving, but the law and the policy and the ethics around it has not yet caught up. And so one of the problems that we're finding with cellular agriculture and other emerging biotechnologies is that there's no policy. And then if there's no policy, where are the carve-outs or the spaces for us as Māori to have our rights and interests recognised within that? So how do we make sure that Māori rights and interests are going to be respected and protected and advanced within this emerging biotechnology? So for me in particular, I'm going to be looking at and applying a lot of the things that I learned through my work with the United Nations on DSI to this, so that when the policy eventually is able to develop, we're ahead of the curve and we've got something here that says, hey, why don't we look at these particular aspects? So our data sovereignty and our intellectual property and the protection of our Tauranga Māori and the protection of the taonga species themselves, as well as our rights and responsibilities as kaitiaki of these species. How do we recognise that in this emerging technology? And how do we stop the risks of biopiracy? So this work being done without us, without proper consultation. And when it goes wrong, how do we make sure that we try and stop it from having these really big risks that surpass our ability to look after this species or have a say? So we're looking at international and national solutions. So international law, the CBD. At the national level, we've got a whole bunch of different things going on there, Te Aki Taonga and things like that. And then on a contractual research and collaborative level in a research project, at those three different levels, where can we assert our Māori rights and interests? And then hopefully by the time that this research is done and this biotechnology evolves, when the policy does eventually start to evolve to catch up, we'll have something there that we can say, hey, maybe the things that we should look at are here. Maybe we should protect our data in these different ways. So kia ora, really looking forward to that. I'm doing it through Vic. Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks, Katie. So you can see that there's just really sort of a whole range of different contexts where the underlying problem is the same or the underlying challenge is the same. And they're just different ways, different areas where it can be applied. Also, just want to highlight a couple of new projects that we're getting involved with at the Institute. One is this one around, it's actually about research reciprocity, but it's in the context of ancient crop genomes. And this is an international project that's thinking about essentially how do we deal with climate change, how do we feed the world, how do we make crops more resilient, but doing that by going back and looking at ancient crops and the sorts of characteristics that are sitting within those that might have been dropped off as the crops were developed into the modern varieties which we have now. And is there something that can be brought back into that sort of space? And this is, and there's a science project that is doing that work. And then this component is really looking at the community engagement components around it and talking with communities in Rapa Nui and also Nunavut about that. So there's a component, this is led out of the University of Iceland. There's a component looking at research reciprocity and sort of some of the more kind of legal and policy elements. A bit around collaborative research and community engagement, which we are responsible for alongside the rest of the team and doing. There'll be a focus on knowledge translation. So part of the research reciprocity is, how do you provide benefits back into communities and what's required to build capacity amongst the scientists so that they will kind of act and operate in a more respectful manner. So that's sort of one project which is about to start in the new year. And here's another one which was just announced for funding around indigenous yeast. So thinking about kind of like microorganisms. And there's, does anyone take probiotics? Yeah, so you've got probiotics, have people talk about the microbiome. There's all these kind of little things that sit around. When we're doing our kind of guidelines working around genomics, we talked about the microbiome is contributing to the mode of something. So often, you're trying to keep keep healthy by maintaining your, what do they call it? The microbiome healthy. So that keeps you healthy. So it's kind of contributing to your mode. And that's how we used to talk about it in that context. But this is a project that will be looking at particular yeasts and thinking about how do they help you give unique flavors to non-alcohol beer and wine. And so this is a cool project, in part because it's working alongside the Garage project. So yeah, I'll be looking forward to kind of tasting things that come out of that. But it's not so much about that part. It's really about if we're finding indigenous microorganisms here in New Zealand, how do Māori benefit from that moving into this commercial space? Like, what are the opportunities for Māori producers, iwi in the place where those things come from? And this is exactly the same as what you might do with kawakawa, but it's just another kind of thing. So what we have been talking about doing here is just really thinking about the components that sit within the science, but how do they curate the information as it comes in to make sure it's consistent with Vision Mātauranga and the sorts of guidelines that have been created by places like Kingitanga. How that information is also then consistent with international principles like the care principles, and then really just thinking about how Māori think about people and provenance and the protections as it moves through that sort of innovation pathway. So there's kind of seemed like 4 active or almost active projects that show that there's actually a real interest amongst the science community in doing this kind of work. And, how do we find a space so that we benefit from that? So we've got a chance for a sort of like a chance for you to ask some questions if you'd like. And then we've got some questions for you as well. So anyone got questions for any of the people who have spoken so far? Oh, yeah.
Emma was just observing that not much conversation around genetic modification. So have we advanced so long along the spectrum that they're now being morphed into what you've been talking about?
Yeah. So if we think about when the conversations around genetic modification happened, and that was like, right at the beginning of the early 2000s, and they had the Royal Commission on GM, and there was a lot of controversy, particularly in Māori communities, but not just Māori communities, about what that meant for society. I think what you've found is a couple of things. Over time, the technology has developed, but also I think people have become more familiar with it through films and movies, and just that they've heard about it. When they first heard about it, it was like kind of shocking. Over time, there's been controversies, but probably not as many as might have been kind of perceived. And so the work that was being done in ag research, which was the one that kind of prompted the Royal Commission here in Aotearoa, when they went back and got a re-consent for continuing their research, it didn't have the same controversy sitting around it. I think the shift, no one talks about GMOs now in the science space, because that's like, it's hard with all of that kind of bad baggage. But they're talking about, genetic engineering, gene editing, and they talk about that as being something that's more precise. They've moved away in a lot of cases from trying to do the cross-species sort of work. So rather than doing cross-species work, they'll look at different varieties within the same species and just move the genes around within it. And that kind of gets a little bit away from some of the concerns, but these are the sorts of, conversations and things to talk about. Outside of that, though, there's actually a whole range of different sorts of genetic research that can be done that aren't even close to genetic engineering or genetic modification. And so one of those things is like eDNA. And so people do like monitoring for species in different places, and they do essentially like a barcode. You can take a sample of soil, and it gets trace DNA from everything that's being passed through. And, it's kind of quite useful for conservation monitoring. But that sort of data you get from those projects, you can't use for the commercialization one because there's not enough information. So not every sample is the same, and not every set of genetic information is the same. But then you'll have projects, say like the ancient crop genome one, where they are trying to get the whole kind of string of genetic information, so then they can use it for multiple purposes. And I think, it's how do we become more familiar with that? So in that situation, we got really strong protections, and maybe at this other end we go, it's okay, as long as you've done this, then that sort of stuff is fine. Emma, was that a good enough answer?
Beautiful.
Kia ora. Hātai no? No? Okay. All right. So we've got some questions here. For some reason, I had in my mind that we'd be sitting around tables and you could talk to each other and it would sort of look like that. But you're kind of quite spread out. So if you want to kind of squeeze up a bit, you can just have talks in little groups of 3 or 4 or 2. But here's a question. What are the key challenges for kaitiaki or Māori with biodiscovery research? So take a couple of minutes to talk it through, and then I'll get some answers or some thoughts.
Discovery is like digital too. Like research so it's like this very technologies and work like how I don't know they share
Okay. Kia ora. How about we quickly go around and get an idea from each of these little cluster groups? What's something from down here?
One problem for us is maybe Kaitiaki is what does biodiscovery mean?
Kabai.
We're just talking about the kawa and making sure this young lady pointed out that what we don't want is a careful replication of, New Zealand says Manuka honey, and maybe one even says, well, hang on, ours has got this sort of medical or medicinal. We don't want the same thing to happen to the kawa. And I know it's already out there because I had a ginger and kawa tea on my way down there. So we're trying to think of how can we protect that, even if we talk about the patenting, which I know is a bit of an old-fashioned English term, but we're all for making sure that something like the KatieLee can be such a medicinal, not only internally but on the skin. How can we protect it?
Yeah, great.
I'm not even Maori. I just want to make sure that is part of the ecosystem going forward for the Maori people.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
I wouldn't really know.
Huh?
I wouldn't really know.
Okay. Cool, that's right. Georgie?
I think there are a lot of challenges in terms of like intersectional relationships there can be with tongue species, and also just not there can also be like not a lot of awareness of what tongue species are being used and what purposes. So the like the communication line stuff.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. We talked about funding, so this might be a problem. Like to make research, we need funding, we need resources. So this was one thing that we discussed. We discussed a lot of things.
Yeah, I heard a lot of buzzing happening down and around there, and even on this side over here.
That's interesting. Okay, but we're talking a little bit more about the Katia and Maori and how the landscapes and environments have changed because of human development for the need for structure. And I guess before even looking at biodiscovery research, you know, you have to take into consideration the whole landscape has changed because of the need for dairy farms or care group and the downflow effects of the waterways and everything that affects on the bedway. So I got stuck on that part.
I'm sure we could go around and get some more, but we'll save that for later. Here's your next question. How could existing access processes for taonga species and associated mātauranga Māori be improved? Now, that's a tough one, eh? While you just mull on it, because I don't think you're going to answer it, I'll tell you why we're having some of these sort of conversations. So at the moment, there's, as you would have taken from the national context and the work and the advocacy of Te Taonga and Te Taumata Whakapuma, there's also interest from the government in starting to put together a biodiscovery policy. And so that activity is sort of underway. And there's likely to be some things come out in the future. But if we want to be able to input into it, we need to be having these sorts of conversations now, so that we can inform what happens with that, both from like a practical way, so in terms of like the projects that we're involved in and how we're dealing with scientists and other people, but also the policy that gets put in place around how they need to act or what might happen once things hit the patent office or head off down these other tracks. So, I mean, these end up being the sorts of questions that get bounced around and needing to be kind of thought through and thought about. And another question could be how those sort of intersecting interests of kaitiaki across the motu. So, you know, when we're thinking about an iwi's interest or another iwi's interest in the same species, how do we deal with that? It's not always going to be something unique related to that species in all the places, or even if it is, one person might have like the unique nice thing or the thing that can generate value. Think about manuka, the ones that have high UMF factor, and then other ones will have manuka honey, but it won't have that kind of value associated with it. So those things happen, and what does that mean for people in those places, but kind of Māori generally, and how that will play out across every species we have in the country. So not going to kind of talk about that, but really just to sort of think and mull these sort of things, some of these sort of issues over. There's a lot of those conversations I think probably happened in the Te Taonga kind of space and amongst that community. And I think accessing those resources will give you a little bit of an idea, but there's other conversations that need to take place as well. So what we want to do is give a little bit of an overview of some of the biodiscovery, we call them biodiscovery resources, some of the resources that have been put together by our team over the past few years. I'm going to come back to this one later because we can play this. This is Manu Caddie, who was one of the lead technicians working with Te Taonga, and what he's put together in terms of a platform as a kaitiaki register. We've got a video. He's offshore at the moment and he couldn't zoom in at the moment because he's traveling, but we've got that there. I'm just going to hand over to Katie to talk a little bit about some of the guidelines that have been created. And so these are the things you picked up at the back. So some of these guidelines, some of the other resources as well.
Kia ora. So I'll talk to you mainly about Kingitanga because that's one I'm most familiar with. And I wanted to give you a little bit of background on how it came to be. So originally, a couple of years ago, we started a project looking at all the different intellectual property laws across New Zealand and to look at what provisions were there for Māori within those laws. And we found that aside from a Māori advisory committee that was saying this might be offensive to Māori, the protections for Māori knowledge was quite threadbare. So then we said, okay, well, at the institutional level, at universities, Crown research institutions and things like that, what kind of internal policies at these research institutions are there to protect Mātauranga Māori and traditional knowledge? And again, some places were really strong and some places had really threadbare Mātauranga Māori policies or provisions for Māori within their IP policy. So what we said next was, okay, what do we need to do to help? Okay.
Just hold.
Okay. What else do we need to do to help improve this situation? And so we started writing the He Tohuahi guidelines for protection of Indigenous cultural intellectual property in innovation and research. So originally we wrote this for for researchers to use as a first step to when they're approaching Māori communities, what kind of conversations they should be having and what kind of topics should be discussed in a research contract. And then key feedback we got from when we circulated that first draft was actually the real need was for communities to have a resource to use where they could be empowered going into these kind of conversations. So this is how He Tohuahi was born. And it really takes you through kind of a contract negotiation sort of style where you go through each of the different topics that could or should be discussed when you're having a conversation with researchers about doing a research project together. So it takes you through what kind of good things to look for in a research partner, what intellectual property protection could look like, what data protection could look like, and those sorts of things, as well as a little bit of background about the laws in New Zealand and internationally. And then right at the back, there's a list of questions that can take you through the questions that you should be asking of researchers. So it's really intended to be quite high level, quite simple, and as a first step for communities to use. And we're really excited about this. This was published last year, and we'd love for you to take them, hand them out to people. They're really quite useful. And then also we have Katiaki, and this is another guidelines document that's specifically about research for genomic research with taonga species. And Maui can probably take you a bit more through in detail because he was there throughout the writing process. But it's, again, a guideline document to take you through what kind of topics you should be thinking about when engaging in genomic research on taonga species and what kind of equitable relationships look like in relation to research around it. So that's the last you'll hear from me, by the way. So I did quite a high level and everything, so if you have more questions, let me know.
Oh, thanks, Caddie. So these ones we're really thinking about the same kind of context of genetic research with taonga species and the issues that you're dealing with, particularly as the data is generated. So one of the issues is that when you generate information and science data from it, it gets shared with a whole lot of people often. So that the culture is that you have to make the data available and publish the data, not just publications. And when you do that, it means it's available for anyone around the world to use in different projects. And so that sort of idea of how do we ensure that there's the Indigenous voice or that provenance back to the communities that have been a part of the project sit with that information, sat behind the work we've been doing with local context and traditional knowledge labels. Traditional knowledge labels and biocultural labels. So you would have heard people here talk both about protecting Mātauranga Māori and something about like traditional knowledge, but also protecting taonga species. Now, if we do sort of like a project with kawakawa, and there might be some traditional knowledge about it, that doesn't necessarily get used as a part of the science process, the scientific process, generating this other data. That data will end up maybe on a different database than the place where the story that gets told about it ends up. And the protocols around sharing the story might be different from the protocols around sharing the data. And so that's why we've ended up in the situation of having both labels that apply to traditional knowledge and then different labels that apply to what we call not biocultural labels, but really apply to the scientific knowledge. And you'll see here These are the traditional knowledge labels. Yes, they've got TK there. And just dealing with issues of provenance. So what are the things that connect it to people? The protocols. So what sorts of traditional rules or tikanga might have set around how things got shared. And you'll see that we've tried to reflect it in this kind of poster we've got here. This was one we were using in the early stages around thinking about how to describe it. And there's a couple of examples, including the work that we did with whakatohia on the back of it. And this example here, this is a little comic that was put together working alongside the Shinnecock Nation, which is in Long Island by New York. And they were working with the New York Botanical Garden around all of the different plant species that have been collected from their territory over time, and starting to re-establish a relationship with those species, but also with the institution, and putting labels on that. And so that's a part of a kind of another kaupapa around a Centre for Braiding Indigenous Knowledge and Science, which is reflected on the back as well. And you'll see here there's some of the different ways in which the labels then get used. So they often sit in databases, but they can sit on other things as well. There's the Whakatohia Waikato, which was developed here alongside Alvin and the team in the computer department here. There was a project they did with Danny. And then there's this one interesting one here where it's a medicine garden. And so in the medicine garden, they put the labels actually kind of, when they burn it into the wood. And so they're kind of sitting there in that form as well as being on the brochures. And so this was, you can go to the local context website and see, a range of different films. This is one of the communities there. It's like it's a nice quote of them talking about how they've managed to reclaim language resources from an institution and bring that back into their community and reestablish that sort of knowledge about those songs. And they said, one of the most powerful things we've experienced as a community is gifts coming back from the ancestors. So even though it had been in a museum, they saw it as coming back in the right kind of time. There's, in a couple of weeks, there'll be another documentary coming out, which is about work with the Quechua in Ecuador, who are the community that have a relationship with the living forest. And so they've started to put labels on scientific data generated from their territory, but their labels come from the community and the forest together. So they're kind of jointly applied to that. And there's the documentary will talk about that kind of context. So the next thing we've got to talk about here is our online educational game. Oh, Natalie.
Award nominated. Kia ora, everybody. Ko Natalie Kusabs aho.
Put it on, please.
Yeah, I'm doing that. No te aroa, tu whare tō Ngāti Maru hoki. I'm working alongside Maui and Keti at Te Kotahi Research Institute. Right, I'm just going to go find the game.
You want me to do it while you talk?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do that. Firstly, I have to acknowledge a couple of very good collaborators of ours, Jane Anderson at New York University and Tim Coltman, who's also sort of at the University of Waikato, but they can't be here today. They've been foundational in the development of this game, and a big acknowledgement to GOAR, who have helped us to develop this, particularly Finley Howard. We had the pleasure of spending some time with Finley last week when we were nominated as a best online framing game. We didn't win. It's a long story, but congratulations to New Zealand Post and their really boring game. So I'm just going to quickly run through the benefit sharing compass game. This is live, but it's still under development. So if you want to have a play with it, you can. Also, I should acknowledge some of our friends who've helped test this, one of which is Poya, who's in the room, and Danny. So here's our game, benefit sharing compass game. It kind of follows on from what Caddie was saying earlier about how the guidelines were originally intended for researchers we went a different route with guidelines, but this game has sort of taken us back there to help researchers to understand how they can best work with communities. And we developed it partly out of the Tikanga and Technology project, which was MB, but also from the Sept project, Science for Technology and Innovation. So thanks to the funders. Right, let's begin. I always got a new laptop, so let me just negotiate this. So this in this game, you are role-playing and you are being a researcher who's about to start a project with community, and this will go through all the steps that you take to get access, to work with the community, to build relationships, and follow that process through eventually to commercialisation. So about that. How do you negotiate different worldviews when it comes to these kind of studies? Okay, let's put a name down. Let's try Maui. Then if we crash out, he can get blamed. Right, so it's scenario based. You're role playing as a researcher. We have 3 different scenarios that you can try. One is a fungus, small project with one community looking at a fungal species. The next one is a seaweed project. You might see some themes here. So we're going back to seaweed again. And that's working with multiple iwi across Aroa here. And the third one is kawakawa, which is when you're working across nations, communities of different nations. So let's go with seaweed. So this comes through, it gives you a little bit of information, and you are about to negotiate some access to this resource with your community and start a relationship. As you go through the game, the choices that you make will give you different scores for relationships, so how are you getting along with the people that you're going to work with. Fairness, so are you actually being fair in your actions, and equity, which is about how well the benefits that you negotiate are spread across the community. So those little boxes up there on the left are the scores, and they give you a progress score as you work through the game. So here's our tribal leaders, and we're going to start off with the first choices you make when you're first working into the community. So here's your first lot of options. So you can choose one of these 3 options and you can see how those scores are going to change. So let's go for the top. When you have a go at this, you can all have a try. Let's try and make sure that I don't crash out and and fail at the first hurdle. So this one is about DSI. So this is about the digital sequence information that Katie was talking about as she was working through. Oopsie, I was quick to hit it a little bit far. So now we're at the point where you're talking about how are you going to share the benefits from your research with the community that you're working with. So I'm going to choose to use biocultural labels from the local context. So you can see how that's changed our scores up there. So we'll continue through the game. This gives you a little rundown on what the iwi are thinking when you make your decisions. So this is hopefully going to educate some of the researchers as they go through. Now we get to the point where we're talking about the actual benefit sharing. So I'm going to establish some formal partnerships with the communities that I'm going to be working with. Remember, this seaweed one is with multiple communities. Hopefully, I'm not going to fail. Yes, yay. So this one gives you a stage, at the end of each stage, you get a result on how well you're doing on those 3 scores, so your relationship, your fairness, and your equity. So I obviously need to do a bit of work on fairness, but otherwise, I'm kicking. Right, now we're up to the really, really fun bit, which is when I get to spend non-existent money. So you've gained access to the community, you're happy to work with you, and now you've got your project, you've got a budget, and you're going to talk about how you're going to share benefits that are non-monetary. So you're not in a formal contract where you're paying for services, but your non-monetary benefits still have a cost to your budget, for your project budget. So we can choose along the scale, we can choose to spend 8% of our budget or whatever. So let's go with 8%, just arbitrary. And this is the really cool bit. Now I get to spend that money. So since I can't do it in life, my husband won't let me, I'm going to use it over here. So I have 100,000, 105,000, and I can spend it on, where's the mouse gone? On stuff. There it is. I would like to have a master's student, and I would like to run a series of small workshops since I'm going to multiple communities. And I would like to have a part-time researcher. And maybe I would like to run, what can I have? A community event. And an intern, because I like interns. So here's our money. I've managed to spend most of it. Maybe I'll have a couple of interns. So this is how you can choose to select how you're going to share benefits with the community. So one thing you'll notice there is no back button on this game. So you have to live with the decisions you make. You can't change your mind. So just as in real life, you've made a decision, you've got to stick with it, you've got to make the most. Some of the decisions you make in these stages will have consequences in further stages. So if you've decided to not invest in a community relationship, when it comes to doing something later on, you'll find you can't do that because you haven't invested. So that's the end of this stage. Just finding my mouse again. Is this touchscreen on? Yes, it is. Great. So you've done your 4 years of research and you've now got to the point where you're into the commercialisation phase of the research. You've made a product, it's going well. Now your role has changed from being a researcher to a product development and being part of a project development team. And you're going to see the person, Jasmine, who's the CEO at a company. And Jasmine and you have slightly different priorities now because you're having to start to think about the company's reputation as well as the development of the product. So here's the key considerations that you need to think about. So as you go through the games, these will prompt up. So you don't need to memorise these 7 considerations. And this is called a consumer choice experiment. And what you get to do is you get to choose which of these 3 options you most value and which one you least value. And it will randomise the selection. And as you go through, you get to do this. Let's go with this one and this one to start with. These are very random, so don't judge me. Let's go with that one. So we get 7 of these choices. And let's go here and there. At this point, you can't see how this is going to affect your relationship, equity, or fairness. But look at that, I'm really fair. My random selections are really fair. So this comes up and tells you how well you've done. So my equity is medium, my fairness is high, and my relationships is medium, which is not too bad. All of those 7 choices that you get to make are important things. So it's just when you're trying to prioritise to find out which of those is your most prioritised consideration. So you're getting some feedback about whether or not you are happy to continue to work, and Arfina is going to come and help you with your community work. Let's go through this. Prior choices have enabled us to be able to have some cultural license to operate, which is what a lot of the companies are interested in. And then at the end, you get a ticky to say whether or not you've been really good, okay, or you really need to do some work. So this is actually a really good way for research to see whether your worldviews do not align with communities and what they may need to be working on. Okay, we're now into the strategy of commercialisation. Okay, here's your choices. I might make this a bit of a team one. Who would prefer approach 1? You have, you're going to be informed about it, but we're not going to let you have any power going forward. Hands down, everyone, for that one. Okay, let's go. Who would like to give ownership and leadership with a higher potential return? Put your hands up if you prefer. Approach 4. 1, okay, you're out. Okay, for approach 2, who would like to be recognised as a stakeholder and have some influence and receive some project in sport? Receive, don't look at receive. All right, 1, I'm thinking number 3. Partners with commercial involvement and supply relationships. Okay, let's go with that one. You're going to receive, you're going to work with partnership, you're going to have some general things, you're going to deliver. So, okay, fairness is high. Your equity is not quite so high, in relationships is medium. So this is the end of the game, and then you get a feedback panel about your choices and how you've gone through the game. So we are, and it gives you a whole lot more information about where your strengths and weaknesses are. So that's been a really great project and we've really enjoyed working on. We had a little chat before when we were doing the one about things that make it hard for communities to engage in this kind of research, biodiscovery research. And one of the things we talked about in the group was about informed consent, like actually understanding what you need to know before you get into a research project. We're hoping that this extension of this game might be able to help people as they go through that process. Kia ora, everyone. Appreciate it.
Kia ora.
Appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, don't worry. Yeah, so that's kind of, so that's sort of a different way that we're trying to engage people in conversations. And so a lot of the discussion that we've shared this with different people, even ones in sort of companies and science groups, feel that it's really useful in prompting kind of thinking about things in a different way. And we've also got colleagues that are interested in using it in their classes and having their students think about these issues as well. We've got intentions to develop it further. There's interest from people in Australia to try and adapt the case studies to cases in that country. We want to adapt it into Spanish so we can use it in Rapa Nui and some other places as well. And also work with sort of real commercial companies so that when we get to the kind of the back-end commercialization component, they're talking about the sorts of decisions which they have to actually make. And so we want to kind of integrate that into it a little bit more as well. But it's a pretty sort of exciting little project that we've been working on. The one last thing that we have to share here is what I mentioned before about this kind of Kaitiaki register project, which Manu Caddie's been involved with. He can't be here today, but he recorded this earlier. What did I do? Did I turn it off? Oh no. Wait. Kia ora. Thanks, Manu. So I just, yeah, so look, so thanks. I just want to mihi kia Keti, Natalie, Danny, and Caddie for their contributions to today. Thank you all for coming along. This was sort of, really the beginning part of just starting some conversations around Indigenous biodiscovery. You'll see that we're going to get involved in a lot more projects in the space. And what we're intending to do is run annual wānanga. And not something like this where largely we just talk at you and you sit there and go, thanks. But something that can be a lot more interactive. So probably over a few days, bringing in different people that are working on projects, talking about issues, thinking about different sorts of resources or tools that might be useful and helping with that. So in some ways, this is a little bit of just a highlighting that something to keep a watch out for. Certainly, once we get kind of dates and times and things together, we'll be circulating that and making sure that's on the Te Kotai Research Institute socials. So link to our, what are we on? LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, any of those things. Join our hashtags, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the future at other events. So just want to say kia ora to everyone. I know we have some love people with those really nice shirts. The Kingitanga Day shirts. I'm not quite sure how I get one of those, but I think you had to actually do a real job. So kia ora.
Just want to give a big to spoke today. Thank you guys. Here's a mihi from us, the uni, to you guys. The kaipuni.
I know. Danny. Caddie, Natalie, and Keti. Oh, there might be some for people that aren't actually here.
Oh, I told them.
KatieLee, Maui is me. Danny, you got one for Danny? That one there. And that one you can give to kids. Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi kia koutou. Hope you enjoy the rest of Kingitanga Day and thanks for coming. Kia ora.